Tizala's heart raced as she stumbled through the dense forest, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The crash of her escape pod had shattered the peaceful stillness of the night, leaving a trail of burning debris behind. She clutched her side, where a sharp pain reminded her of the wound she had suffered during the crash. Her pale violet skin shimmered faintly in the moonlight as she searched for a place to hide. She had been warned about humans. Her people spoke of them as dangerous, selfish beings who would exploit anything they could. To be stranded on their planet was a nightmare she had hoped to avoid. But now, here she was, alone and injured, with no choice but to evade capture. The sound of rustling leaves made her freeze. She pressed her back against a tree, her large, golden eyes scanning the shadows. A figure was approaching, tall, broad-shouldered, and undeniably human. Panic surged through her veins. She had no weapon, no energy to run. Her mind raced through the warnings her elders had drilled into her. Humans are unpredictable. They will capture you, experiment on you. Trust them at your peril. The human stepped into the clearing. He was a young man, wearing simple clothes that were stained with soil, as if he had been working the land. His hands were empty, and his expression was one of curiosity rather than malice. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice carrying no threat. "I won't hurt you." Tizala didn't understand the words, but the tone was strange. It lacked the sharpness or hostility she had expected. Still, she didn't lower her guard. She edged backward, her injured leg giving way beneath her. She fell with a small cry, her alien pride wounded more than her body. The man hesitated for a moment, then knelt a short distance away. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though trying not to frighten her. He placed a hand on his chest and said, "Daniel." Tizala tilted her head, confused. Was he trying to communicate? She studied him closely, looking for signs of deception. His face was open, his dark brown eyes steady and kind. He pointed to himself again, "Daniel." Realizing he was telling her his name, Tizala hesitated, then pressed a trembling hand to her chest. "Tizala," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel smiled, and the warmth of it caught her off guard. He reached into his bag, slowly pulling out a small container of water and holding it out to her. Tizala's instincts screamed at her to refuse, to distrust this human. But her body was weak, and the thirst was unbearable. After a moment's hesitation, she reached out and took the water. Their fingers brushed for an instant, and she was surprised by the gentleness in his touch. As she drank, her fear remained, but a tiny spark of doubt about her beliefs began to flicker. Could humans really be so different from what she had been told? Tizala awoke to the sound of chirping birds and the faint rustle of leaves. For a moment, she panicked, her instincts urging her to flee. But as her vision cleared, she realized she wasn't alone. The human Daniel sat a few steps away, tending to a small fire. The gentle warmth of the flames contrasted with the cold air around her. She tried to sit up, but her body protested with sharp pain. A low groan escaped her lips, drawing Daniel's attention. He turned quickly, concern etched on his face. "Easy," he said softly, his hands raised in a gesture of reassurance. Though Tizala didn't understand his words, the tone conveyed his intent. She froze, unsure if she should trust him. Daniel moved slowly, pulling a small first aid kit from his bag. He opened it, revealing bandages and ointments. Tizala's golden eyes narrowed as she watched him closely. When he reached for her injured leg, she flinched, baring her sharp teeth in warning. Okay, Daniel said, backing off slightly. He held up the bandages, pointing to her leg, then to the kit. His actions were deliberate, as if trying to explain. Tizala hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of fear and doubt. Humans were supposed to be cruel, weren't they? Yet this one seemed different. Slowly, she nodded, keeping her eyes locked on his every movement. Daniel worked carefully, his hand steady as he cleaned the wound and applied the ointment. The sting made her wince, but she didn't pull away. She couldn't help but notice the gentleness in his touch, so different from the harshness she had expected. As he worked, Daniel spoke in his strange language. His words were soft, almost soothing, though she didn't understand them. It was as if he were trying to keep her calm. When he finished, he stepped back and gestured to a small bundle of food beside her. It was simple, a piece of bread and some fruit. Tizala eyed it warily, her hunger warring with her mistrust. Daniel took a piece of the bread and ate it in front of her, a small smile on his face. It was a strange gesture, but it seemed to be his way of showing the food wasn't poisoned. After a long moment, Tizala reached out and took the fruit. The sweetness exploded on her tongue, and for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of strength returning. Daniel watched her, his smile widening. He pointed to himself again and said, "Daniel." Tizala swallowed the fruit and hesitated before repeating his action. "Tizala," she said quietly. The human's expression brightened, and he nodded. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a sense of safety, perhaps even hope. But as the warmth of the moment settled over her, a shadow of doubt lingered in her mind. Could she really trust him, or was this just the calm before the storm? Days passed, and Tizala's wounds slowly began to heal under Daniel's care. She still didn't fully trust him, but the constant kindness he showed was hard to ignore. He didn't rush her or demand answers. He simply let her rest, offering food and warmth whenever she needed it. She spent her time observing him, trying to understand what motivated him. Daniel worked on his small farm during the day, tending to plants and animals. He never seemed angry or frustrated, even when things didn't go as planned. He would laugh at his mistakes, shrugging them off like they were nothing. Tizala had always been taught that humans were driven by greed and cruelty. But Daniel didn't act like any of the stories she had heard. His life was simple, and yet there was a quiet joy in the way he moved through his days. One afternoon, Tizala watched him as he worked in the garden, wiping sweat from his brow. She tilted her head, her golden eyes studying him with a mixture of fascination and confusion. "What are you doing?" she asked, the words coming out before she could stop them. Daniel looked up in surprise, then smiled. "I'm planting seeds, so I'll have food to eat later." Tizala furrowed her brow. "Food grows in the ground." Daniel chuckled, clearly amused. "Yes, it does. It's how things work here. You plant, you wait, and then you harvest." Tizala watched as he dug small holes in the soil and dropped in seeds. It seemed so simple, yet she could sense a deeper purpose in the way he cared for the earth. It was as though the land itself mattered to him. She took a step forward, her voice tinged with curiosity. "You don't take everything. You let it grow again." Daniel nodded. "That's right. If you take too much, you'll run out, and that's not good for anyone. You have to give the land time to heal." Tizala stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She had never thought about the world in such a way. In her own world, resources were often taken without thought, and everything was about survival. Quick, decisive, and often ruthless. Daniel's gentle approach to life made her question everything she had known. She had expected humans to take what they wanted, to dominate without care. But Daniel was showing her a different way. A way of respect, of balance, of compassion. Later that evening, as they sat together by the fire, Tizala looked at him and asked softly, "Why are you helping me?" Daniel paused for a moment, staring into the flames. "Because you needed help, and because I believe everyone deserves kindness, no matter where they come from." Tizala's heart skipped a beat at his words. Was it really that simple for him? Could he truly see her as something worthy of kindness, despite everything she had been taught? She didn't know the answer, but for the first time since her arrival on Earth, she felt a sense of peace. As the days turned into weeks, Tizala began to let her guard down. Though only slightly, Daniel continued to care for her with patience, and each act of kindness chipped away at the walls she had built around herself. Still, The weight of her upbringing, the warnings, the fears lingered in her mind. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Daniel began to talk about Earth. He shared stories of human history, of triumphs and struggles, of wars fought and peace sought. Tizala listened intently, her golden eyes wide with curiosity. She had heard tales of Earth's past, stories of destruction and chaos, of humans fighting each other over resources. But Daniel's version was different. "We've had our dark moments," Daniel admitted, his voice soft. "But we've also learned. We've grown." Tizala furrowed her brow. "Grown? How?" Daniel smiled, his gaze turning toward the stars above. "Through mistakes, through pain, but also through love and hope and creativity. We've learned to help each other, to build a world where we don't just take from it, but give back too." Tizala's heart stirred with a strange feeling. She had never heard of humans being capable of such things. Her species had always believed that humanity's survival depended on taking, on fighting. But here was Daniel, speaking of building, of giving. "Do you think your people could learn this?" Daniel asked gently, his eyes meeting hers. Tizala hesitated. "I don't know. We've always been taught that survival comes first, that we must protect ourselves at any cost." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand. It's hard to change what you've been taught, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. Maybe you could teach your people what you've learned here, that there's more to life than just fighting." Tizala was silent for a long time. She had never considered that her people's way of thinking could be wrong. She had been raised to believe that the universe was a battlefield, that every encounter was a test of strength and survival. But Daniel's words felt different. They spoke to something deep inside her, something she had never fully understood. "What if my people don't listen?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with doubt. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "Then you can show them. You've already seen what's possible. You've seen that humans can care for each other, even when it's hard. You can help them see that too." Tizala looked at him, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. Could it be true? Could she really change the way her people saw the universe? The thought was overwhelming, but it also gave her a spark of hope, a hope she hadn't felt since she first landed on this strange, beautiful planet. For the first time, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be the bridge between her people and the humans. The days passed, and Tizala's life on Earth began to feel almost normal. She and Daniel spent more and more time together, their bond deepening with every passing moment. She learned about his world, his hopes, and his dreams, and in return, Daniel learned about her people, her struggles, and the pain she carried from her past. Tizala found herself laughing at Daniel's jokes, something she hadn't done in years. He had a way of making her forget her fears, of helping her see the world through new eyes. When they walked through the fields, Daniel would point out the different animals and plants, explaining how they all fit together in the delicate balance of life. "There's a way that everything works together," he told her one afternoon as they watched a family of deer grazing in the distance. "Even the smallest creatures have a role. It's all part of something bigger." Tizala listened intently, trying to understand. Her species had always believed in survival of the fittest, that strength was what mattered most. But here, in this simple world, Daniel was showing her that kindness, patience, and balance could be just as powerful. It was on one of these walks that Tizala began to notice something new, a warmth that wasn't just from the sun or the fire. It was in the way Daniel looked at her, in the small gestures he made to show he cared. When she got tired, he would slow his pace, walking beside her in silence, as if to say, "I'm here, and you don't have to carry it all alone." One evening, as they sat by the fire, Tizala found herself sharing more than she had intended. She told Daniel about the war that had torn apart her home, about the loss of her family, and the fear that had driven her to escape. "It was hard," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "I thought I was the last of my kind. And when I arrived here, I thought humans would see me as a threat, something to be destroyed. Daniel listened carefully, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't speak, just nodded, letting her words settle between them. I thought I could never trust anyone again, Tizala continued. But you've shown me that maybe I can. Maybe humans are capable of more than I believed. Daniel reached out and gently placed a hand over hers. You're not alone anymore, Tizala. You've found a place here, and I'll always stand by you, no matter what. Her heart skipped a beat at his words. She had expected rejection, fear, or maybe even hatred. But instead, she had found acceptance. She had found someone who was willing to fight for her, not out of duty or obligation, but because he genuinely cared. For the first time since arriving on Earth, Tizala felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. The pain of her past still lingered, but it no longer defined her. With Daniel by her side, she began to believe that a different future, one filled with trust and understanding, might be within reach. The peace that Tizala had begun to feel was shattered one morning when Daniel rushed into the small cabin, his face pale with worry. Tizala had been sitting by the window, watching the rain fall in sheets over the land, when she saw his expression and instantly knew something was wrong. What happened? She asked, her voice sharp with concern. Daniel closed the door behind him quickly, his eyes scanning the room before he spoke. We have to leave. Now. Tizala's heart skipped a beat. Leave? Why? What's happening? Daniel turned and walked toward the window, his gaze fixing on the distant hills. I saw some men, humans, but not like the ones around here. They're not from the village. They've been watching the farm for days, and they know something's wrong. Tizala's breath caught in her throat. The thought of being discovered by humans she didn't trust, who didn't know her, filled her with dread. She had always feared that humans would turn on her, and now that fear was becoming a reality. Do they know about me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded. They saw something last night. Your footprints in the mud. They're probably looking for you, or worse, they might already be closing in. Tizala clenched her fists, panic rising within her. She hadn't been careful enough. Her escape had been rushed, and now Daniel's safety was at risk because of her. We can't let them find us, she said urgently, looking around the cabin for anything that might help them escape. Daniel's face softened with determination. We will, Tizala. I won't let them take you. We'll hide, and we'll find a way out of this. But even as he spoke, Tizala knew there were too many risks. If these men were from the government, they wouldn't stop until they had captured her. The thought of being taken, of being locked away or experimented on, made her sick to her stomach. She had to find a way to protect both herself and Daniel. I can't let them hurt you, she said, her voice firm. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip reassuring. You're not alone in this, Tizala. I'm with you. We'll think of something. Tizala nodded, but the uncertainty still gnawed at her. She didn't know what to do, but she knew they didn't have much time. The rain continued to pour outside, the sound of it growing louder, mixing with the rising tension in the air. Every minute felt like an eternity. Tizala could hear the distant rumble of a vehicle in the distance, and her heart raced as she realized the men were getting closer. We need to leave now, she urged, her voice rising with urgency. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed a bag, quickly stuffing it with essentials. Food, water, and a few tools. Follow me. We'll go through the woods. It's the fastest way out. Tizala followed him without question, her heart heavy with fear for what was to come. She had never been this far from safety before. But now, with her life on the line, she knew she had to trust Daniel completely. Together, they had a chance to escape. But as they stepped into the rain-soaked woods, Tizala couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closing in. The dense forest swallowed them as they moved quickly through the trees. The rain had soaked through their clothes, making the ground slippery beneath their feet. Tizala's heart pounded in her chest, the sound of rushing blood almost drowning out the noise of the rain and the wind. She had never felt this kind of fear before, not even when she fled her own planet. The thought of being found by humans, by those who might treat her as an enemy, made her feel small and vulnerable. Beside her, Daniel was moving with a determination she had never seen before. His eyes were focused, scanning the path ahead with a kind of urgency that told her just how serious the situation was. Every now and then, he would glance over at her, offering a brief, reassuring smile, as though to remind her that they were in this together. "Stay close," Daniel murmured, his voice low but firm. Tizala nodded, taking a step forward. She trusted him completely, but the uncertainty of what was ahead made her nerves tighten. She knew they were running out of time. The sounds of the men's search party were getting closer, their voices rising above the howling wind. "Do you think they'll find us?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. Daniel glanced back at her, his face set with determination. "I don't know, but we'll make sure they don't." They pressed on in silence, the only sounds the crunch of wet leaves underfoot and the occasional distant shout from the men. Tizala's mind raced. She had to think of something that could help them hide, something that could buy them more time. Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard the unmistakable hum of a vehicle engine. Tizala's heart stopped for a moment. The men were getting closer, much closer than she had expected. "We can't outrun them," she said, her voice tight with fear. Daniel stopped and turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers with a calmness that gave her a strange sense of comfort. "We don't need to outrun them. We need to outsmart them." Tizala frowned. "How?" Daniel's eyes darted around, scanning the trees. His mind was already working, thinking of a plan. Finally, his gaze landed on a small cave hidden among the rocks and foliage. "There," he said, pointing. "We can hide in there for now. It's the only place we can be sure they won't find us quickly." Tizala looked at the cave. It wasn't much, just a small, dark opening in the side of a rocky outcrop. But it was their only option. They moved toward the cave as quickly and quietly as they could, slipping between the trees with the stealth of shadows. Daniel led the way, and Tizala followed close behind. The sounds of the search party were now much louder, the vehicles rolling closer, their lights flashing between the trees. As they reached the entrance of the cave, Daniel turned to her, his face serious. "Stay quiet. Don't make a sound." Tizala nodded, feeling her breath quicken as they stepped into the darkness of the cave. They pressed themselves against the rocky walls, barely daring to breathe as the sounds of the men's search party grew louder and closer. Tizala's thoughts raced. Could they really escape this danger? Could they trust in each other enough to survive? The moment felt like an eternity. But in the darkness, with Daniel by her side, she realized something. For the first time since her crash landing, she didn't feel entirely alone. The cave was dark and cold, the only sound the gentle drip of water from the rocks above. Tizala and Daniel stood motionless, their backs pressed against the rough walls, as the voices of the search party echoed through the trees. The minutes felt like hours, each breath heavy with tension. Tizala could hear the men's footsteps, the crackling of their radios, the sound of their voices growing closer. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had never felt so vulnerable, so powerless. The cave offered them only the smallest protection, and with every passing second, the danger seemed to grow. Daniel was focused, his eyes scanning the entrance to the cave, his expression calm. Despite the overwhelming odds, he didn't seem afraid. He had a plan. Tizala could see it in his eyes. "We need to move quickly," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "They'll be here soon. Follow me closely." Tizala nodded, her mind racing. They had to get out of here. The cave was a temporary refuge, but the men wouldn't stop searching until they found her. Daniel was right. They had to move now. He led her further into the cave, deeper into the darkness, until they reached a narrow passageway. It was barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, but it seemed to stretch on for what felt like miles. "This leads to the other side of the mountain," Daniel explained in a low voice. "It's a hidden exit, known only to a few people. If we can get to the end, we'll be far enough away that they won't be able to follow us." Tizala's heart skipped a beat. It was their chance, maybe their only chance, to escape the search party. But as they stepped into the narrow tunnel, her mind remained uneasy. Could they really make it? Could they outrun the men and vanish into the wilderness? The passage was cramped and damp, the walls slick with moisture. As they moved forward, Daniel held a small flashlight in his hand, its beam flickering on the rough stone walls. The darkness seemed endless, the air thick and heavy, as if the tunnel itself was closing in around them. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. Tizala could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the fear creeping back into her chest. Every creak of the tunnel, every sound that echoed in the distance, made her think that the men were closer than they really were. After what felt like hours, Daniel stopped and turned to face her. "We're almost there, just a little further." Tizala nodded, trying to steady her breathing. She had to trust him. He had kept her safe so far, and she couldn't afford to lose hope now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they'd reached the end of the passage. The faint light of day filtered through a crack in the rocks. Daniel pushed at the stone, and with a low groan, the entrance to the cave slowly began to open. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the air felt fresh. The forest stretched out before them, untouched and vast. Tizala took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. They had made it. But as they stepped out into the open, Tizala's gaze turned toward the horizon. The danger wasn't over yet. They still had a long way to go, and the search party was still out there, hunting for them. But for the first time in a long while, Tizala felt a spark of hope. They were free. For now. And with Daniel by her side, she believed they could escape whatever came next. Tizala and Daniel stepped carefully through the dense woods, each step bringing them farther away from the search party. The tension in Tizala's chest remained, though, the fear still gnawing at her. She could hear the faint hum of engines in the distance, the men's vehicles searching for her, and she knew they couldn't afford to be careless. Daniel led the way, his every movement measured, but Tizala could tell he was just as anxious as she was. They had no idea how close the men were, and with each passing minute, their chances of staying hidden grew slimmer. "We need to find a place to hide," Daniel whispered, his voice low. "Somewhere they won't think to look." Tizala nodded. She could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on her. If they were discovered now, it would all be over. She glanced around, her golden eyes scanning the trees, looking for any sign of a safe place. They continued moving through the forest, staying close to the ground, and using the thick foliage to cover their tracks. Every now and then, Daniel would stop and listen, his sharp senses picking up the faintest sounds from behind. The search party was getting closer, but so far, they hadn't spotted them. As the hours passed, the sky began to darken, and the sounds of the forest grew quieter. Tizala's legs were sore, and her exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but she didn't dare stop. Not yet. Finally, Daniel stopped in front of a large tree with low-hanging branches. "We'll hide here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If we stay still, they won't notice us." Tizala looked at the tree. The branches would provide cover, and the thick roots could hide them if they lay low enough. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. They crouched down, carefully positioning themselves beneath the tree's dense foliage. Tizala's breath came fast, and her hands shook from the effort of staying still. She could hear the men's voices now, clearer than before. They were close, too close. "I'll stay here," Daniel whispered. "You go ahead. I'll hold them off." Tizala's heart stopped. "No, Daniel. You can't. They'll hurt you." Daniel's face softened with a sad smile. "I can't let them take you. You're more important than I am." Tizala grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "I won't leave you." Daniel's gaze was firm. You have to. If they find us together, they'll capture both of us. But if you go, they'll focus on me. You have a chance to escape, Tizala. You have to take it. Tizala's throat tightened as she stared at him. Every instinct in her screamed to stay, to fight alongside him, but she knew he was right. She had to survive. She had to go back to her people, and she couldn't do that if they were both captured. I will come back for you, she promised, her voice breaking. Daniel nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. I know you will. With one last look, Tizala turned and ran, moving swiftly and quietly through the trees. Her heart ached, but she forced herself to keep going. Behind her, she heard the men's voices growing louder, then a shout from Daniel. Over here. Her heart twisted with the sound, but she didn't stop. She had to keep moving. As Tizala ran through the forest, she made a silent vow. She would never forget the sacrifice Daniel made for her, and she would come back, no matter what it took. The forest seemed endless as Tizala ran, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath her feet. Her chest burned with each breath, but she didn't stop. Daniel's voice, his sacrifice, echoed in her mind, urging her forward. She had to make it out. She had to survive, for him, for her people, and for the hope they had shared. As she ran, Tizala could hear the men's voices behind her, growing more distant with every step. She pushed herself harder, the adrenaline coursing through her veins, guiding her through the thick underbrush. There was no time to look back. She couldn't afford to dwell on the pain of leaving Daniel behind. The night was quiet, the moonlight casting long shadows across the path ahead. Tizala's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and determination. She had never been this far from safety, but now, with Daniel's sacrifice driving her forward, she felt a strange sense of purpose. She had to make it. She had to find a way to show her people that there was more to life than survival, that humans were not the monsters they had always believed. After what seemed like an eternity, Tizala reached the edge of the forest. She slowed to a stop, her heart pounding in her chest. The clearing before her stretched out, bathed in the soft glow of the moon. In the distance, she could see the lights of a small village. She had made it. She was free. For now. Tizala collapsed to her knees, exhausted and gasping for air. Her body ached, but the weight in her chest was heavier than anything physical. She had left Daniel behind. The guilt gnawed at her, the knowledge that she had made a promise she couldn't yet fulfill. But as she sat there, staring out at the village in the distance, something inside her shifted. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel entirely alone. She had survived. And she had learned something that would change everything. Daniel had shown her that humans were not just capable of cruelty and destruction. He had shown her that kindness, compassion, and sacrifice were just as much a part of their nature. The stories she had been taught about humans, the ones that painted them as monsters, didn't tell the whole truth. With newfound determination, Tizala stood up and dusted herself off. She had a purpose now. She would find a way to help her people see what she had seen, to show them that humans could be trusted, that they could be allies, not enemies. As she made her way toward the village, Tizala felt a sense of hope that she hadn't known before. It wasn't just her survival she had fought for. It was for a future where understanding and cooperation could replace fear and conflict. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be obstacles, challenges, and battles to fight. But Tizala knew one thing for sure. She would never forget Daniel. His sacrifice had given her the strength to believe in a different future, one where peace could be more than just a dream. And as she walked toward the village, she couldn't help but smile. It was a small, fleeting moment of peace, but it was enough to give her hope that maybe, just maybe, she could change the future for both her people and humans.